Well, Vanessa, thank you so much for being on the podcast with us. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Good. Could you maybe start by just introducing yourself for the audience?
Yeah, of course. So again, thanks so much for having me here. Looking forward to this conversation. So my name is Vanessa. I'm a research fellow at the International Center for Tax and Development, which is a research center that focuses on improving tax systems in lower-income countries from an equity perspective, but also from an effectiveness and efficiency perspective. I'm based at the University of Toronto in Canada, and at the ICTD, I co-lead our research program on informality and taxation with Max Galin. And I also work a lot on gender and tax. And within that, my work focuses on two main areas that are closely connected. One is on how governments tax the informal economy, how that impacts informal sector operators and livelihoods, what it means for fairness and equity, but also on informal taxation. So those are payments that are outside of the formal tax system that might be paid to informal or non-state actors like traditional leaders, sometimes armed groups, but that people still have to pay in order to either access services or to operate their businesses. So I've been working in this field for I guess about 15 years now. I've been with the ICTD. I started in 2011. And I do most of my work. So I have a lot of field research experience in Sierra Leone and in Ghana, but also in the DRC and Somalia and in Pakistan.
Great. Maybe we could just start by defining the informal sector. We discussed it briefly in Norwegian because this is in the intro, because this is a concept that might not be that familiar to many people in Norway, since we, I guess, don't have that big of an informal sector in Norway. Could you just explain what it is?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's actually a surprisingly tricky question because there are a lot of definitions of what informality is and what the informal economy is. So it becomes quite difficult to define. And what happens in this space is that people actually start talking past each other. But in tax terms, I think it is fair to say that the most simple or common way of describing informality is thinking about economic activity that isn't registered with the national tax authority or with the national business registry. And we know that in most lower income countries, that is the vast majority of the economy. So most workers operate in the informal sector, and globally 84% of enterprises are informal.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you said in your introduction also that you do quite a lot of field work. Could you say, before we even delve deeper, just a little bit about how does the informal economy look like at glance in those countries where you do your research?
Yeah, so I mean, the informal economy, it looks quite different across different regions, of course, but you can imagine that, because it is the vast majority of economic activity, it is very diverse. It's very heterogeneous. It captures a lot of different types of economic activities, and I think one of the big problems is actually that there's often a narrow idea of the informal economy as something that is more homogenous. You know, when people talk about the informal economy, they're often thinking about people selling on the streets or market traders, but we know that it's actually much more heterogeneous than that. But we also know that common ways of approaching the tax sector tend to focus on those on that kind of stereotypical idea of informal economic activity. And I think the other big problem here is that there's often a common assumption that the informal economy is untaxed, right? So that there's an assumption that they're not paying taxes, they're not paying their fair share, and that's not fair to formal businesses. So then that leads to policies and a policy focus that is centered on trying to capture informal operators into the tax net. There's often this assumption that there's like a hidden gold mine in the informal sector that's waiting to be tapped. That's just like revenue authorities just need to go out and get it. But the reality is that we know, and our research has shown widely across contexts in Ghana and Sierra Leone, DRC, other ICTD research that's been done in Zimbabwe, that informal operators and businesses, they're already paying taxes, often in multiple ways. These are coming in multiple forms. They're paying at the national level through things like simplified tax regimes, but they're also paying at the local level through business licenses, market fees, other types of fees and dues. And as I alluded to in kind of the introduction to my work, they often also pay to informal actors or institutions in order to operate. So my recent research with colleagues in markets in Kinshasa shows that people in order to operate their businesses in markets have to pay additional informal payments to police officers or to traditional authorities in markets where those actors are operating. And all of these burdens, I think, are often invisible in many ways. And that's why there's this kind of assumption that informal operators are untaxed. So they're often not counted in public finance analyses. This fragmentation as well, even between the local and national level types of payments, mean that they're often, we have this layering of taxes that happens with people paying to multiple actors, but it's often not being counted. Yeah.
So is it, you sort of alluded to maybe earlier that what we usually think of the informal sector as being is like, for instance, street sellers. Is it the case that these are also more typical parts of the informal sector that are being taxed, whereas other parts of the informal sector is not as much being taxed, and sort of how this relates to sort of the tax justice perspective of how to actually tax the informal sector and whether we're doing it properly?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, you've hit on one of the biggest problems actually is this mistargeting of efforts of tax collection. So exactly as you said, what we see and what the research shows across multiple contexts is that there is this mistargeting that happens. So it's it's much more common, it's much more common for instance, market traders to face higher tax burdens than higher income professionals that might be, for instance, operating a business within their house that's less visible to the state. So we know that actual tax burdens are strongly correlated with visibility to the state. That's not surprising. People who are easier to find, who are on the street, even retail operators or street traders, they're more likely to be taxed. We also know that those actors tend to be perhaps less politically powerful or less able to resist coercive forms of taxation, less able to lobby for change or for reform. So what we see is that often this very skewed tax collection in practice, with the lowest income earners actually being targeted much more than these higher earners. I mean, in fairness to tax administrations, that's because it's hard to do. It's hard to find those people. So it takes additional effort, and it takes investment in that capacity within administrations to be able to do better targeting and assessments. But all of this absolutely is critical to a discussion around tax justice and equity, because it's all about who's actually paying. And the other dimension here is that the ways that informal sector operators are taxed, the common ways, and there are common approaches across countries, are highly regressive. Not just because of the targeting dimension, although that's a big part of it, of who's actually getting taxed, but we also know that the ways that these businesses and informal workers are getting taxed are regressive. Sometimes because the taxes are being levied at a flat rate. So we can think, for instance, about market traders. They often pay a daily fee in order to operate in a market, but it's the same regardless of your income. So we know that, of course, that's going to affect lower income earners more than higher income earners. And we also know that the research shows that even where policies are designed to be progressive, which is often the case with simplified tax regimes, in practice, they're still regressive because there aren't minimum thresholds, which means that they end up capturing very low income earners rather than only paying once you're above a certain threshold, or the threshold is either too low and the rates at which people are being taxed are just not aligned with an actual understanding of people's earnings, which are often much lower than is often assumed. So there's often like this misalignment with actual, even like poverty indicators with what people are actually paying.
It's I mean, you're saying so many interesting stuff. I like want to touch on so many of those things, but I think one of the biggest things that I'm kind of inspired to talk about when you put out this picture of taxing the informal economy is exactly this like justice dimension, or this idea of, you know, what outcomes can you get in terms of taxation when you're part of the informal economy? Because we've had episodes before, and also generally, I know from the research that, you know, tax is very much a bargaining power, and especially in countries maybe where the tax system is a bit more in development, or maybe not, you know, as in Norway, like our experience with the tax system is that it's this mammoth of like everything kind of works, like you know you can trust it, you know, all of this stuff, but how can you like participate in this negotiation kind of through your tax when you're a part of the informal sector? Because you're asked to pay regressively, potentially, or you're asked to pay a lot of different types of taxes, but you're not really getting the same type of representation through like formal employment or through like organized arbeidsliv, like organized labor force. So how does this play out, like with this like negotiation, justice, and what consequences are there for the outcomes?
Yeah, this is I think a really important question, and one that is often forgotten. You know, this dimension of paying tax, or there's often kind of the push to tax the informal sector, but without thinking about what they're getting in return, or whether they have access to channels of accountability. You know, there's often this assumption, as you say in the literature, that, you know, by paying taxes, I'm going to be able to better make demands of my government and hold them to account and get better services. You know, and that's, of course, you know, an ideal vision of what tax can be, that it can actually play this role as a catalyst for greater accountability and better governance. But that's a lot harder in practice than in theory. It doesn't often materialize in practice. You know, we know that the reality is that informal operators and businesses, they're paying taxes, but they're not seeing benefits. They're not getting much in return, if anything. And they often don't feel like they have channels of accountability. They don't have ways of making those demands. And in practice, what we often also see is, you know, there's such a trust deficit. People have such low trust in the state and low expectations of what the state will actually deliver. That's sometimes what we see is that it's often more desirable and more common for people to actually just turn to private service providers rather than trying to make demands of the government to improve the services that they should be getting for their taxes. And of course, then people are paying extra user fees in order to access services. So that, you know, from an equity and even just a poverty livelihoods perspective adds to those burdens. And I think that what we see also is, or one of the related problems that we see in this field is that there tends to be an assumption as well that certain things will follow from paying taxes. So not just accountability, but when we're thinking about informal operators, as you say, you know, there might be assumptions that they might be able to access certain benefits of being more formal, right? So that formalization will lead to benefits for firms, whether that's, you know, being able to better access credit or be able to grow their businesses, or, you know, be able to access things like social protection from the state. But again, you know, in practice, it doesn't just happen automatically. My colleague Max and I, we call this like a type of magical thinking that happens, of just like one thing's automatically going to lead to another. We know that doesn't happen, but the focus of policies tends to be on the tax and extraction side, but not on the how do we support businesses to better grow? How do we support businesses to access social protection? How do we ensure that we are having better providing those reciprocal benefits? So I think that that's something that we see this real disconnect and imbalance. And that's not to say that, informal businesses and there are lots of informal labor unions and associations in many countries that, play a role in advocating for informal businesses and taking complaints to local governments or to the national governments. But as ever, I think it's kind of the reality of who's being heard and the politics of who actually has that power. And we see that play out in practice just again and again.
So is it maybe a bit too much focus on taxing the informal sector? You should think about other things as well when you, as you say, support businesses and make sure that people actually get the benefits that they deserve when they are taxed. And is it also the case that it's not that much revenue to get from the informal sector? It's a huge part of the economy, of course, but as you mentioned, the people that are actually being taxed are not the richest people. It's as you mentioned, it's an imbalance there as well. So is it not that worth it? Maybe even just throwing that out there.
Both are really excellent points. Just to go back to your first point first, I think that you're exactly right that there is that imbalance. And one of the things that we try to advocate for in our work is what's called a services first approach. So trying to establish the trust with informal operators and businesses first before trying to extract more taxes from them. Because, as I said, there tends to be this trust deficit and what we also call kind of a gap in credible commitments of people don't believe that the government's actually going to do something for them, even if they start paying taxes for the first time. So, making investments in, often small, but very visible and tangible types of service provision as a way of building that trust can be one approach. But I think also thinking more about the social protection side as well, thinking about who has access to social protection, what that looks like in relation to tax. All of that is really important. But your other point, I think, is actually a critical one. Both, thinking from an equity perspective of who's actually being taxed, that has implications for the efficiency and effectiveness of these tax policies. And I think it's a really interesting thing that we see that not only are the common strategies to tax the informal sector hurting the lowest income earners, and importantly, women are concentrated among those lowest income earners. So there is also this gender equity impact, but they're also not actually raising revenue for governments. So it's no one's winning here. These policies aren't serving anyone. As I said, policymakers often describe, and there tends to be, it's not just from, technical policy circles. There tends to be popular narratives within media, journalism that see the informal sector as a missing gold mine, as this hidden gold mine of revenue. But what we know is that taxing it usually brings in way less revenue than is expected. It contributes very, very little to the government budget, to tax to GDP ratios. And, the research also shows that sometimes the cost of collection actually exceeds the revenue that is brought in. Wow. So my colleagues have done this great new study, my colleague Max and a partner at the Ghana Revenue Authority, Alex Combat, did this great study recently that showed that the tax stamp, which is one of the ways that the Ghana Revenue Authority taxes informal businesses, it's part of a simplified tax regime. The cost to collect that actually costs 9 times more than it was bringing in revenue. So we can see that it's so inefficient.
Wow.
For the reasons that you highlighted, right? That it's predominantly targeting the lowest income earners, many of whom are below what would be a reasonable minimum threshold of payment. And because it's very time intensive, requires many tax collectors to actually go out into the field and find the businesses and tax them and follow up with them, it ends up being just so inefficient. And the problem is that these costs of collections are often not factored in. So I think this recent study was maybe the first that I've seen that is actually factoring in the cost of collection. But because there tends to be just this these narratives around the need to tax the informal sector, it continues to be relied on as a policy tool, or is seen as kind of like a silver bullet or a solution for governments that do desperately need revenue. And actually what we're seeing now as well in the context of aid cuts and, global fragility and instability, governments under such fiscal pressure, and they're under fiscal pressure to raise revenue very, very quickly in the short term. So they have kind of this short-term mindset, which leads them, we see kind of a doubling down of policies to tax the informal sector, even though we have this growing body of evidence showing that it's not working for anybody. But because it's one of these things that's easier to do in the short term, we know where the informal businesses are. We can just go out and get money from them today, rather than investing in kind of the longer term tax capacity that's actually needed to raise revenue much more efficiently in a smarter way, and that would actually contribute to equity as well.
So what are, do you have any examples of what could be alternatives? I mean, both in terms of the long term, but also shorter term, are there alternative sources of revenue? I mean, for us, we work a lot on equity in terms of corporations, big corporations paying a reasonable amount of tax, but also in terms of ultra rich individuals, people with really big fortunes. And I do know, especially from the African continent, that what's it called, illicit financial flows stemming from those two types of sources are big, huge. So is there, I'm obviously now leading up a bit in this question, but are there other sources of revenue that are maybe a bit unexplored because there's so much focus on kind of expanding the taxation of the informal sector?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that, I fully agree with everything you just said in terms of what different priorities should be. I mean, absolutely. I believe there needs to be a shift away from taxing the informal sector, and we know that there are opportunities to tax in ways that will raise more revenue and that will be more efficient. And what we know as well, if we're thinking about just kind of the way that tax administrations are structured, they have scarce resources, and in lower income countries, of course, that capacity is limited. So how you actually harness those resources and that capacity, how you actually utilize staff, is really important. So thinking about kind of the trade-offs, if you have so many people going out into the informal sector to tax small businesses that aren't raising revenue, how else could those people be utilized? But also recognizing, of course, that some of this requires, building longer-term technical capacity. That's, as I said, revenue authorities are under a lot of pressure. It's hard for them to do that in the short term. But I fully agree. There's a lot of opportunities, especially there's in many countries, corporations are undertaxed. We have a lot of inefficient tax exemptions that we see that could be bringing in a lot more money. But I mean, think more generally, just thinking about taxing, higher income individuals, more profitable firms. We see, there tends to be such a focus on income within the informal sector, but less focus on undeclared income within the formal sector. So there's a lot that gets lost within the formal sector. And as you say, better targeting, there tends to not be, often for political reasons, targeting of wealthier individuals. And it's, sometimes it's technically difficult to do. But I think we're seeing now, governments do more and try more to target high net worth individuals, but things even like property tax can be a way of raising revenue at the local level, but that are also going to be more progressive, and are going to, can be designed in a way that actually target wealth. I think that there are a lot of options here that are underexplored. Again, some of which require building capacity within tax administrations, and that requires support and kind of some kind of grace that this will be, a longer term thing. But I also, I think that we have to be a bit realistic, even though I would like governments to stop taxing the informal sector tomorrow, that's not going to happen. That's not going to go away. So we also try to be a bit pragmatic and think about, okay, knowing that this isn't going to go away, and that not all attention is just going to go tomorrow to taxing big corporations and high net worth individuals. There are still actually very practical things that governments can do to increase the equity and the efficiency with which the informal sector is taxed. That's better targeting higher income earners within the informal economy. So we know that there are higher income earners that aren't registered. I had given the example of professionals. That's a common one, but also we can think about wholesale traders. There are pockets of high earners that need to be better identified. This could involve things like sector-based approaches. So thinking about, how to actually target, what approach is needed to target higher earning professionals rather than survivalist traders. So again, kind of going back to the definition and how we see the informal economy, of kind of understanding the diversity and heterogeneity, not just taking one blanket approach, but thinking about how we can actually do that in a more targeted way. Another area is around risk-based registration and enforcement. So actually better using data to identify and target those that should be registered. What happens now is often governments do what are called mass registration campaigns, where they often go out just door to door within a business district and try to capture every business. And we know that's inefficient. We know that those businesses that are captured within those exercises, captured within the tax net, often are below a minimum threshold. Often, even if they get registered with the tax authority, they're often not paying taxes in the end. They might not file. Even if they file, they might not be declaring any income. So just thinking about using data better for better targeting. But the other things that I had mentioned as well around kind of the problems we see with the fact that there often, aren't even minimum thresholds for the simplified tax regimes that exist. A recent study by colleagues at the World Bank showed that 2/3 of simplified tax regimes in sub-Saharan Africa don't have a minimum threshold. So actually just having a minimum threshold would help protect the lowest income earners, but also even where those exist, ensuring they're being enforced, ensuring that it's actually well aligned with poverty metrics, with an actual understanding of real earnings. All of those things, I think, can actually do a lot with the systems that exist today, while hopefully in the background also investing in that capacity for in the coming years to actually shift greater attention to those higher potential areas.
I have a weird question. Maybe a bit dumb question that I've kept thinking of now is, and it's a normative one, and I'm just going to say it. Is it a goal to not have an informal sector? Is it a goal to make it formal, or is it a point to have it because it's rich and it's diverse and it's good? Sorry, it's a bit of a dumb question, but I kept thinking of it. You mentioned that we should not tax it first and foremost because we should make things better before we do that. But is it sort of a narrative underlying there which is sort of trying to make it more formal?
Yeah, I don't think that's a dumb question at all. I think that's actually how much of the policy discussion in this area for many decades has been focused on, kind of this idea. There's an implicit normative assumption that what we want in the end is a totally formal economy. That might be the case. I don't know how I feel about that, but I think just pragmatically, I don't think it really matters right now, right? I think that the focus, if the goal, which tends to be the case, the goal is often formalization, right? We want to formalize. We see, so many policy interventions, many of which cost a lot of money, aimed at how we can formalize the informal economy, how we can formalize businesses. What is actually preventing them from being formal, but a lot less policy attention on what are the benefits of being formal? What does it mean to be formal? Sure, you can be registered with the revenue authority and with the business registrar, but what does that mean? How does that change your opportunities for the growth of your business? How does that change your access to service, to social protection? What we see now is that even where, as I was saying earlier, even where businesses become formal, they're not seeing those benefits. And even when those benefits do emerge, they tend to be for larger businesses. So it's kind of the very small survivalist businesses that when they register, they're not going to see those benefits. So I think it's, actually requires kind of a stepping back and reframing the kind of the problem, rethinking the problem. I don't think the problem is informality. I don't think that's a problem to solve. I think the problem is like these underlying structural conditions within the economy that are not allowing people to have opportunities, that have, mean that within economies there's very few employment opportunities for people. Most people I think would rather have a stable income through formal employment rather than being on the street trying to hustle and trying to make something work, right? So I think that that limit of opportunities, that limit of economic growth and potential is actually the problem. And then in turn, I think the problem is that the informal sector is defined as a problem, because then that really shapes like how it's approached rather than seeing it as, something that can be part of a solution.
Yeah, because I guess I imagined that, for instance, labor rights is something that you only can have access through the formal sector because it has to be formalized and all that. But being in the formal sector does not automatically guarantee labor rights. So to your point, you have to like look at the underlying structures and not just make everything formal. You have to build the economy the way that you have to anyway. Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah, no, exactly.
I think that's I feel like we're getting not closer to a solution, but at least like we're getting closer to having seen kind of the outline of the issue here. I just wanted to kind of take us towards an ending and talk a little bit more about sort of this development perspective of it. I mean, a lot of what we talk about now is like it can be framed within this efforts of developing an economy or like, reaching certain targets. And especially if you bring in like international organizations or development corporation, donors, there's been a lot of focus on taxation, building capacity in tax administrations, but also expanding the formal economy as like a good in itself. And I think, at least from my experience from those fields, I really see this normative, underlying normative narrative that you guys were kind of talking about now of like, formality equals good. Formality equals more revenue. Formality equals more development. Do you see that there's a sort of top-down approach here? Like, are there donors coming in and saying, we need this and this and that? And does that impact the way that you work on the ground? Or, because you also talk about, internal revenue pressures, and obviously that's like something that arises within a national context. So could you talk a little bit about this, like to kind of bring it all together, I guess?
No
a
pressure.
Little challenge.
Yeah, no pressure. Yeah. Find the solution and wrap this up nicely. No, but I think that, what you've said, I think is really important, of kind of like where these pressures are coming from. To tax the informal sector. It's something that, we think about a lot. So my colleagues and I think about a lot, because it's, it's kind of like this puzzle, right? Of everything I've said, we know that, the ways the informal sector is being taxed are highly unequal, they're regressive, they're inefficient, they're not bringing in revenue, but yet we still see them happening. Like I was saying, we see this doubling down now because of the fiscal pressure. So like really a question that we've been trying to answer is like, where is that coming from? Why does this happen? Why does this keep happening? Right. So, unsurprisingly, I think, a lot of it is politics. Everything is political at the end when it comes to taxation. But thinking about, some of the ways that these like multi-level pressures emerge. So as you say, there tends to be, there is definitely a role of international actors here in either in reinforcing certain narratives and, kind of this idea of informality as a problem that needs to be fixed. is pervasive, and that does come through in whether in policy advice or when we think about, for instance, IMF loan agreements, the conditionalities that are included within those. Thinking about kind of the metrics of success for governments tend to often be things like, or we often see this, that it tends to be success based on like the number of new registered businesses. And like, that's the end goal in itself, right? So it's not thinking about, okay, what happens beyond that, or it's not even thinking, necessarily about, the revenue perspective, but okay, we know we need to we need to expand the tax net. So let's have the metric be something, that's fairly simplified. I mean, so, we have these pressures that come down, the narratives, I think, that come through even just through many policy think tanks and institutes, consultants. It tends to reinforce the same sort of narrative. And I think one of the problems that we see and that we try to push back on is really just like a disconnect in a lot of that policy advice between what people are saying will solve people's problems and how people themselves actually understand their problems, right? So if you and it's really not capturing. So I think, kind of the top-down perspective that you outlined, I think is exactly right, that tends to happen. We don't have the bottom-up voices. We don't actually have as much engagement and voice from informal businesses and workers themselves about what they actually see as their problems and what they need. So then there's like this real disconnect and just like a disconnect in understanding as well, right? So, a lot of the problems that we see are a result of like actually, sometimes policymakers being a bit clueless about the earnings and incomes of low income operators. Like, they don't actually realize how low those earnings are, how hard it is actually to make a living, and that all has an impact in terms of the policies that are being set. That we have this disconnect with, the rate that the minimum threshold is, that's totally misaligned with how people are actually living. So we have that disconnect. We see all these pressures that happen. Part of this is, as you say as well, of course, like there's the pressures at the domestic level. Some of that, of course, is influenced by international factors and the global system and inequality in the global system. But there are, of course, the domestic political pressures that come into play as well, in terms of who is being targeted, who is not, this kind of short-term thinking, the short-term policy planning, the pressure to kind of get revenue today rather than investing in longer-term solutions. So all of it, I think is interconnected, and we see those play out at the local level as well. The pressures that local governments face in a context where, we've had widespread fiscal decentralization in many parts, in many lower income countries, but those governments often don't actually have sufficient revenue handles that are available to them. So then they tend to rely on, it's surprising, but often relying mostly on things like market dues. Market dues make up a surprisingly large share of the budgets of local governments. One of the things that it could be doing differently would be investing more in property tax capacity. Again, there are political reasons often why that doesn't happen, but there are also technical capacity limits. But again, this kind of short-term thinking means that governments rely on kind of like easier to collect revenues rather than investing in it. But yeah, I kind of see like all of these pressures at the local, domestic, and the international level intersecting to reinforce kind of these narratives and the policy and the reliance on these policies. And I think, more generally thinking about kind of the way that knowledge is generated and constructed and disseminated in this space, again, kind of reinforces these ideas in a way that can be really problematic, of kind of the informality as a problem, of the informal sector as untaxed, even though that doesn't hold up empirically, this sense of unfairness, that those get repeated and reinforced because I would argue of the way of where that knowledge and where the power structures of knowledge creation are coming from. And again, really not actually capturing the voices and perspectives of informal businesses and operators themselves.
I I mean, I think that's a great way to sum it up. Good job. You stood up to the challenge. I will just say as a finishing word that I'm really glad that we have good researchers like you and your colleagues that are working and also working with revenues authorities directly, as far as I understand, to kind of bring more light into this issue that seems to be quite understudied. I mean, if they never even did a calculation of the cost of collection before, and there are certain things here that definitely could benefit policy as well if there was more knowledge and that knowledge was more widely disseminated. So I think that's enough. Thank you so much for...
That's enough.
No, I think that's really great. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on Pengeland and talk with us today. And have a great day.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me. It was a great conversation.